We are standing right in the center of Baghdad. The date is March 26th in the year 922 CE.
Right in the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate.
Exactly. And if we look around at the landscape of the 10th century, this is the absolute epicenter of the world. But on this particular day, the intellectual and cultural splendor of the city has been completely overshadowed by this palpable, just suffocating tension.
Yeah, you can really feel it in the primary sources.
You really can. We're on the banks of the Tigris River, and we are surrounded by a surging, chaotic crowd of literally thousands of people. And the authorities have just brought a man out of the dungeons. He is about to face an execution so methodical and brutal that it was designed not just to kill him, but to, completely erase him from the historical record.
And erasing someone in the Abbasid era required a highly theatrical public spectacle. I mean, the state wasn't just administering justice here. They were sending a very specific, visceral message to the populace about the absolute boundaries of theological and, well, political dissent.
Right, which makes the scene unfolding on the riverbank incredibly jarring for everyone watching. Because the man at the center of this violence he's entirely subverting the script the state has written for him.
He's not playing the part of the condemned man.
Not at all. He isn't weeping. He isn't begging the executioners for mercy. And he isn't shouting defiance at the crowd either. Contemporary witnesses reported that as he was being subjected to the initial stages of torture, he was completely at peace. He was actually smiling.
It is an image that has fundamentally haunted the Islamic world, and specifically the mystical traditions of the world, for over 1,000 years. The man facing the crowd is Mansur Al-Hallaj.
Mansur Al-Hallaj.
Yeah, he was a Persian mystic, an ascetic, and a poet. And while the geopolitical machinations that brought him to the executioner's block are, incredibly complex, the catalyst for his death can really be traced back to a single utterance.
Just 3 words.
3 Arabic words that shattered the theological framework of the empire.
Al-Haq. Translated directly, Al-Haq means, I am the truth. But because Al-Haq, or the truth, is one of the 99 names of God in Islam, the statement carries a much heavier, much more dangerous meaning.
Right.
He was essentially declaring, I am God.
And in a strictly monotheistic empire, where the absolute separation between the creator and the created is the foundational pillar of the entire society, those words constitute a theological earthquake. I mean, it is the ultimate transgression.
I want to set the parameters for our deep dive today because we are not just doing a linear march through medieval history here. We've got a massive stack of sources to go through today.
Theological treatises, historical chronicles from his supporters, and of course from his bitter Orthodox detractors.
Exactly, plus centuries of Persian poetry. And our mission is to synthesize all this material to understand the mechanics of mysticism. We're exploring the boundaries of faith, the inherent danger of claiming absolute, unmediated truth, and that incredibly thin line between divine inspiration and dangerous madness.
We also really need to dissect the political economy that made his spirituality a threat to the state in the first place, and figure out what his legacy actually demands of you today.
Because the legacy of Al-Hallaj is not just some dusty historical artifact. It's an active, unresolved philosophical problem.
Yeah, his life forces us to examine the clash between institutional, structured religion and chaotic personal spiritual experience.
So I want you, the listener, to place this dynamic in a modern context. Imagine a figure today who completely steps outside of every accepted societal and institutional structure. They abandon the academic consensus, they reject the religious hierarchies, and they publicly claim they have a direct, unfiltered conduit to the absolute truth of the universe.
It's hard to even imagine how that would play out today.
Right. How does our society process a person like that? Do we elevate them as a visionary, or do we use our institutions to silence them because they threaten our established order? To figure out how the Abbasid Empire answered that question, we have to look at the psychological and cultural soil that produced a mind like Al-Hallaj.
Where does this level of radicalism actually begin?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we have to start in Fars province, in what is present-day Iran, around the year 858 CE. And the cultural context of his family is arguably the most critical key to understanding his later philosophy. His grandfather was a Zoroastrian magus.
A magrigus, like a priest.
Exactly. A priest of the ancient pre-Islamic religion of the Persian Empire.
Okay, wait, I am struggling to understand the timeline here a bit. By 858 CE, Islam had been established in the region for a couple of centuries following the Arab conquests, right? So are we talking about a family that was actively resisting assimilation? or one that was just caught in the middle of a massive generational transition?
It is very much the latter. The Islamization of Persia was not an overnight event. It was a slow, complex, and often really painful synthesis of cultures. His father was the one who actually converted to Islam.
Oh, I see.
So Al-Hallaj is born into a newly Islamic household, but the psychological architecture of his family is deeply rooted in Zoroastrian thought.
And Zoroastrianism is fundamentally structured around a cosmic dualism, right? The battle between light and dark, truth and a lie.
Precisely. It places an immense, uncompromising emphasis on internal purity. This is encapsulated in their core ethical triad, which is good thoughts, good words, good deeds.
Good thoughts, good words, good deeds. So even though he is being raised as a Muslim, he is inheriting a philosophical framework where external rituals are secondary to an absolute internal spiritual integrity.
That's exactly it. That Zoroastrian echo, the idea that the battleground for truth is entirely internal, will become the defining characteristic of his life. So after his father converted, the family moved to Wasit.
Which is in present-day Iraq.
Yeah, and Wasit was renowned as a major center for Orthodox Quranic study, and Al-Hallaj proved to be an absolute prodigy there. Historical sources indicate he had completely memorized the Quran by the time he was 12 years old.
I want to pause on that for a second because, in the modern world, rote memorization is often dismissed as a lower form of learning, like just cramming facts for a test.
Right, but it was very different then.
Exactly. In the context of 9th century Islamic scholarship, memorizing the Quran isn't just about passing a test. It is about internalizing the divine word until it literally becomes the cadence of your own thoughts. It's immersive psychological conditioning.
It's the absolute foundation of a classical Islamic education. But Al-Hallaj was not satisfied with the orthodox legalistic approach to the text. He developed this profound spiritual restlessness.
He didn't want to just be a lawyer or a scholar.
No, not at all. He wasn't interested in becoming a jurist. He began seeking out the esoteric, the hidden mystical meanings of the text. And this led him to apprentice under some of the most prominent Sufi masters of the age.
These were heavy hitters, right?
Oh, massive figures. People like Salih Tustari, Armaraki, and eventually the most respected mystic in the entire empire, Junaid of Baghdad.
And this apprenticeship is happening right during the golden age of Islam. Baghdad is basically the intellectual capital of the planet at this point. You have Greek philosophy, Indian mathematics, and Persian literature all just colliding with Islamic theology. It's a phenomenal melting pot.
It really was an era of unprecedented intellectual synthesis. Interestingly, Al-Hallaj became so immersed in this Arabic-speaking academic and mystical milieu that he allegedly lost his ability to speak his native Persian.
Really? He forgot his native language?
Yeah, he wrote and preached exclusively in Arabic. But conceptually, he acted as a bridge. He was injecting the deeply emotive, almost intoxicating mystical heritage of Persia into the highly structured scholastic theological language of Arabic Islam.
But if he's being mentored by the intellectual heavyweights of his era, why does his life immediately fracture? Like, the biographies note that he marries, but he engages in bitter, constant disputes with his father-in-law. He argues with his teachers. He is eventually completely expelled from these elite circles. I am trying to figure out the mechanism of his ostracization here. Was he simply an arrogant student who refused to submit to authority? Or was there a fundamental incompatibility between what he was experiencing and what they were teaching?
The clash was deeply systemic. It really came down to a debate over the nature of mystical knowledge itself. See, in the 9th and 10th centuries, Sufism, Islamic mysticism, was not a public populist movement.
That wasn't for the masses.
No, it was an incredibly secretive, elite, esoteric tradition. Masters like Junaid believed that profound mystical experiences, particularly the experience of union with the divine, were dangerous.
Dangerous to the person or dangerous to society?
Both, actually. They believed that if you expose the uninitiated, uneducated masses to these concepts, it would lead to theological misunderstanding, social chaos, and inevitably a harsh crackdown from the Orthodox state authorities.
Wow, okay. It sounds like a spiritual vanguard. They're operating almost like a secret society because they view themselves as the only ones equipped to handle the metaphysical radiation of these truths, so to speak.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. They practiced strict internal discipline and kept their mystical revelations, their batin, or inner knowledge, hidden behind the zahir, which is the orthodox outer practice of religion.
So you look like a normal Orthodox Muslim on the outside, but you have these massive mystical secrets on the inside.
Exactly. But Al-Hallaj fundamentally rejected this elitism. He felt a profound, almost manic compulsion to take the secrets of the elite out of the cloisters and bring them directly to the common people in the streets.
I mean, I can see why that would terrify his teachers. If you have spent decades carefully navigating the political minefield of the Abbasid Empire, making sure your mystical gatherings don't trigger a heresy trial, and suddenly your most brilliant student decides to go broadcast your secret doctrines in the market square,
Yeah.
you are going to excommunicate him immediately to save your own life.
And that is exactly what happened. Junayd actually warned him. He famously predicted that Al-Hallaj's desire to broadcast these secrets would end with his blood staining a piece of wood.
Chilling foreshadowing.
Yeah. The institutional structure of Sufism just could not contain him. So, stripped of his mentors and alienated from his peers, Al-Hallaj embarks on a radical, solitary path. He begins a period of extensive, grueling travel and asceticism.
Let's examine the physical reality of this wandering phase, because it begins with an act of extreme physical and psychological endurance. He travels to Mecca for his first pilgrimage, but he doesn't just perform the standard rites of the Hajj and go home.
No, he takes it much further.
Right. He makes a vow to remain in the courtyard of the sanctuary, the Haram, for an entire year.
Yes, a full year under conditions of intense fasting and near total silence.
I really want to break down the mechanics of what a year of fasting and silence actually does to the human brain. If you remove caloric energy, you alter your metabolic state, which impacts cognitive function and emotional regulation.
It strips away your normal defenses.
Exactly. And if you remove language and social interaction, you begin to dismantle the social constructs that maintain your sense of self. He is systematically depriving his body and his mind of the inputs required to maintain an individual ego.
And that is the deliberate goal of extreme asceticism. He is engaged in a process of severe spiritual excavation, just stripping away every biological and psychological attachment that tethers him to his individual identity. When he finally emerges from this year-long vigil, he commits an act of profound symbolic rebellion.
What does he do?
He publicly takes off the traditional patch tunic of the Sufi the kirka, which served as a uniform denoting a person as a member of the mystical elite, and he puts on the regular, unpatched clothes of the lay people.
That is fascinating. We so often think of religious radicalization as someone putting on a specific uniform to separate themselves from the world. But he is doing the exact opposite. He's discarding the uniform of the spiritual elite to erase the boundary between himself and the masses.
It is a radical democratization of spirituality. By wearing the clothes of the common soldier, the merchant, or the artisan, he is visibly stating that the divine connection is not the exclusive property of scholars in Baghdad. It belongs to anyone.
And then he leaves, right? He leaves the center of the empire.
Yes. Following this, he leaves the central Islamic lands entirely. He travels extensively into India, through Turkestan, and along the frontiers of the empire.
So what is he doing out there? Because traveling to India in the 10th century means he is inevitably interacting with non-Islamic ascetic traditions, Hinduism, early strains of Buddhism along the Silk Road.
Historians debate the exact extent of the ideological cross-pollination, but it's highly probable that he encountered and observed Hindu ascetic practices and Buddhist concepts of emptiness. However, it is crucial to note that Al-Hallaj always framed his experiences strictly within the vocabulary of Islamic theology.
Right, so he wasn't just throwing different religions into a blender.
No, he wasn't syncretic. He was synthesizing universal mystical experiences through an Islamic lens. He was gathering followers, writing prolifically, and refining a philosophical framework that would soon make him the most dangerous man in the caliphate.
Let's talk about that framework. To understand how he conceptualized this journey of destroying the ego, we have to look at a specific metaphor he used, which has since become one of the most famous allegories in all of Sufi literature, the moth and the flame.
It is a beautiful and just devastating metaphor. Al-Hallaj used it to describe the epistemology of mystical knowledge, how a human soul actually comes to know God. He breaks it down into the 3 stages.
Okay, stage 1.
Imagine a moth in a dark room, drawn to the light of a candle. In the first stage, the moth sees the light from a distance. It perceives the illumination. In human terms, this represents intellectual or theological knowledge of God. You read the Quran, you study the jurisprudence, you acknowledge the existence of the divine through reason and text.
I want to try and elevate this with an analogy because we really need to understand the phenomenological difference between these stages. Stage 1 is It's like sitting in an auditorium, listening to a lecture about the physics of sound waves, the history of classical instruments, and the biographical details of Beethoven.
I like this.
You possess all the factual, intellectual data about the music, but you aren't actually hearing the music.
That is a very precise comparison. You have the data, but no direct experience. So the moth moves to the second stage. It flies closer and actually feels the heat radiating from the flame.
Okay.
For Al-Hallaj, this is the stage of direct, personal spiritual experience. You are no longer just reading theology. You are feeling the intense presence of the divine in your ascetic practices, in deep prayer, in the emotional rapture of your devotion.
Right. So continuing the analogy, this is when you stop listening to the lecture and you finally hear the orchestra play Beethoven's Ninth Symphony live. The sound waves are hitting your body, the music is evoking a profound emotional response, and you are experiencing the reality of the art directly.
Exactly. It's a massive leap in understanding. But, and this is the crux of Al-Hallaj's entire philosophy, for the true mystic, the second stage is still a failure.
Wait, a failure? Why?
Because in the second stage, there is still a separation. There is still a moth and there is still a flame. There is an I who is experiencing and a thou who is being experienced. The individual ego still exists to observe the heat.
Ah, so the observer effect is still in play.
Precisely. Therefore, the mystic must proceed to the third and final stage. The moth must dive directly into the center of the flame and allow itself to be completely consumed.
Oh, wow.
It burns away entirely. At that moment, the moth ceases to exist as an independent entity. It simply becomes the light and the heat of the flame. This is the absolute union with the divine, the total annihilation of the self.
It's the moment the musician ceases to be a person playing an instrument and entirely loses their individual consciousness in the performance. They don't hear themselves playing. They don't even know they exist anymore. The boundary between the creator, the instrument, and the music completely dissolves, and there's only the symphony.
That captures the essence of it perfectly. And this physical journey Al-Hallaj is on, stripping off his elite robes, starving himself in Mecca, wandering the deserts. It is the physical manifestation of the moth inching closer to the flame, preparing for that final dive.
Preparing to burn.
Yeah. But as he returns from his travels and begins preaching in the heart of the Abbasid Empire, he begins translating this abstract poetic metaphor into highly controversial practical theology. Which brings us to his doctrine of the Kaaba of the heart.
Okay, this is where the theology collides violently with geopolitics. We need to define the Kaaba first. It is the cubic structure at the center of the Great Mosque in Mecca. It is the most sacred geographical site in the Islamic world, the Qibla, or direction of prayer, for every Muslim on earth, and the destination of the Hajj pilgrimage.
Yes. And Al-Hallaj begins preaching to the crowds in the streets, telling them the important thing is to proceed 7 times around the Kaaba of one's heart.
On the surface, that sounds like a beautiful extension of his grandfather's Zoroastrian focus on internal purity.
The good thoughts, good words, good deeds.
Exactly. He is telling everyday people, artisans, laborers, people who likely do not have the financial means or the physical safety to traverse the desert to Mecca, that they do not need to rely on external geography to find God. The ultimate holy site is the purified human soul. He actually earned the moniker, the carter of innermost souls, right?
Yes, his name, Hallaj, literally means a cotton carter. Someone who uses a comb to separate impurities, seeds, and dirt from raw cotton fibers.
Yeah.
The masses gave him this title because they felt he was doing the same thing to their souls, combing away the impurities of the ego and the superficial attachments of the world to reveal the pure spiritual essence beneath.
But I need you to explain the mechanics of why the state viewed this internal poetic teaching as a literal threat to national security. I mean, why does preaching internal purity trigger a state response?
Because you have to look at the political economy of the Abbasid Caliphate. The Abbasid Empire was vast, multi-ethnic, and constantly prone to fracturing. The political legitimacy of the Caliph rested heavily on his title as the protector of the holy cities. Furthermore, the Hajj pilgrimage was not just a spiritual event, it was the massive economic engine of the empire.
How so? Walk me through the economics of that.
Well, hundreds of thousands of pilgrims traveled from across the known world to Mecca every year. This massive movement of people required infrastructure, roads, wells, caravansaries, which the state provided and taxed. The markets in Mecca and along the caravan routes generated immense revenue.
Ah, I see.
The Hajj wove the distant provinces of the empire together through trade and shared ritual. So, if a wildly charismatic street preacher begins convincing the masses that the physical journey to Mecca is secondary or even unnecessary compared to the internal pilgrimage of the heart, he is not just preaching a spiritual metaphor.
Right.
From the perspective of the Abbasid viziers, he is advocating for a boycott of the empire's primary economic and political mechanism.
So if you tell people they don't need to go to Mecca, you are effectively telling them they don't need the caliph, they don't need to pay the caravan taxes, and they don't need to participate in the state's sanctioned structure of religion. He is decentralizing religious authority.
Exactly. And the authorities realized they needed to eliminate him. But prosecuting someone for a poetic metaphor about the heart is difficult, so they deliberately weaponized his words by linking him to a very real, very violent political threat: the Qarmations.
Who were the Qarmations, and how did they fit into this?
The Qarmations were a radical, militant Ismaili Shia sect based in eastern Arabia. They were essentially a utopian, egalitarian rebellion that actively sought to destroy the Abbasid Caliphate.
Okay, so they were an actual military threat.
A massive one. They viewed the Orthodox Hajj pilgrimage as a form of idolatry. They frequently raided pilgrim caravans, slaughtering thousands, and eventually in 930 CE they actually sacked Mecca and stole the black stone from the Kaaba.
Wait, they literally attacked the Kaaba.
Yes. So when Al-Hallaj is preaching about the Kaaba of the heart, the Abbasid authorities deliberately and maliciously misinterpret his spiritual metaphor as a literal political endorsement of the Qarmation agenda. They accuse him of being a Qarmation sympathizer.
That is an astonishingly cynical legal maneuver. They take a profound metaphysical statement about internal purity and they prosecute it as treason. It is the ultimate bad faith reading of a text to justify state violence. And that calculated misinterpretation sets the stage for the most explosive controversy of his life.
The moment he finally dives into the flame.
The utterance of Al-Hallaj, I am the truth. We have to dive incredibly deep into the theology here because this phrase is the absolute fulcrum of his legacy. His accusers, the Orthodox legal scholars, claimed he was committing a specific capital heresy known as Hulul.
Yes. Hulul is a complex theological term that translates roughly to incarnationism, infusion, or indwelling. It is the concept that the divine spirit can descend and take up residence within a physical human body.
Okay, so like a possession.
Kind of. In this framework, there are two distinct entities, the human soul and the divine spirit coexisting within one physical vessel.
Like pouring water into a sponge. The sponge is still a sponge, the water is still water, but they are occupying the exact same space.
Exactly. And in Orthodox Islamic theology, which is anchored in Tawhid, the absolute indivisible oneness and transcendence of God Hulul is strict heresy. It violates the boundary between the creator and the created. It was also deeply feared by the authorities because it smelled of Christian theology, the incarnation of God in Christ, which Islam explicitly rejects.
So the authorities are looking at Al-Hallaj, hearing him say, I am God, and they assume he is preaching Hulul. They think he is saying, look at me, Mansur Al-Hallaj. My ego is so magnificent, my asceticism is so great, that the Almighty has decided to move into my body and share an apartment with my soul.
Yes, they interpret it as the ultimate inflation of the human ego. But that is entirely a misreading of his state. Al-Hallaj was not experiencing Hulul. He was experiencing Fana.
Fana, the annihilation of the self.
Returning to our metaphor, Fana is the state where the moth has burned away completely. Al-Hallaj was not claiming that the human named Mansur had become God. He was declaring that his human ego, his individual consciousness, had been so utterly and completely annihilated in the flame of divine love that only God remained.
Wow.
There was no sponge left to hold the water. There was only the ocean.
He didn't pour a glass of water into a sponge. He dropped a single drop of water into the ocean. And once the drop hits the ocean, you can no longer point to it and say, that is the drop. It has lost all individual boundary and identity. It has become the ocean.
A perfect analogy. As his later defenders interpreted it, he was essentially saying, God has emptied me of everything but himself. The vocal cords vibrating to produce the words Al-Hallaj were physical. But the consciousness directing them was not Mansur. It was the divine reality echoing through an empty vessel.
There is a poem of his that illustrates this perfectly. He wrote, I saw my Lord with the eye of the heart. I asked, who are you? He replied, you. It's just a stunning piece of literature.
It really is.
But, as much as we are exploring the poetic beauty of this concept, we have a mandate to look at all the sources impartially. We're not taking sides here, just reporting what the sources say. And we have to address the orthodox backlash. Because serious, highly educated historians and scholars did not see a moth in a flame, and they didn't see an empty vessel. They saw a dangerous charlatan.
We must absolutely examine the counter-narrative. If we look at the historical records compiled by Orthodox scholars, particularly the later Proto-Salafi historian Ibn Kathir in his monumental work Al-Bidayah wal-Nihaya, the portrait of Al-Hallaj is entirely devoid of romance. Ibn Kathir compiles testimonies accusing Al-Hallaj of being a highly sophisticated con artist.
Okay, let's explore this deeply. What exactly is Ibn Kathir claiming? Because I am always suspicious of historical figures who claim exclusive divine connection. Cult leaders exist. Financial fraud under the guise of spirituality is a very real phenomenon. What is the evidence against him?
Well, Ibn Kathir's compilation alleges that Al-Hallaj used Indian magic, which historians interpret as sleight of hand, illusions, or psychological manipulation techniques he acquired during his travels in the East, to stage fake miracles.
What parlor tricks?
Exactly. The chronicles claim he had a network of accomplices who would bury food in the desert, and Al-Hallaj would miraculously discover it to awe his followers. They accuse him of staging theatrical spiritual healings, specifically to extort vast sums of money from gullible merchants and vulnerable people.
So they're framing him not as a misguided mystic, but as the 10th century equivalent of a fraudulent faith healer running a massive financial scam in the capital.
It goes even further into theological arrogance. Ibn Kathir records testimonies from contemporary scholars who claim they were walking with Al-Hallaj while reciting the Quran. Upon hearing the recitation, Al-Hallaj allegedly turned to them and said, "I can recite the same, or I can compose like it and speak like it."
Oh, wow. Okay, for the listener who might not grasp the weight of that, in Islamic theology, the Quran is considered the literal, uncreated, inimitable word of God. The doctrine of Ijaz states that it is miraculously impossible for any human being to replicate its linguistic and poetic perfection.
It's the ultimate miracle of the prophet.
Right. To claim you can compose something equal to the Quran is not just arrogance, it is the absolute zenith of blasphemy.
It is a total rejection of the prophetic seal. Even his own father-in-law, Abu Yaqub al-Aqta, according to these Orthodox accounts, eventually publicly denounced him, calling him a deceitful sorcerer and a hateful infidel. The Orthodox establishment viewed him as a megalomaniac whose erotic behavior and growing populist following were destabilizing the social order.
It is a remarkable historical tension. As a listener, you are forced to hold two completely contradictory images in your mind. On one hand, you have the view of Al-Hallaj as a pure conduit of the divine, a man who successfully achieved the ultimate psychological unselfing. And on the other hand, you have the very plausible historical reality of a charismatic manipulator who used mystical language and parlor tricks to build a lucrative cult of personality.
That highlights how polarizing he was.
Yeah, and nowhere is that polarization more evident than in his written masterpiece, the Kitab al-Tawasin.
The Kitab al-Tawasin is a profoundly dense, enigmatic text. It is not written like standard theology. Al-Hallaj uses rhymed prose, abrupt shifts in perspective, and he even includes abstract line diagrams and cryptic symbols.
It's like he's trying to express the inexpressible.
He was constantly struggling against the limitations of human language, trying to encode mystical experiences into a medium that was fundamentally unequipped to hold them.
But within this dense symbolic text, there is one section, chapter 6, that is basically a theological hand grenade. He tackles the story of Iblis.
Yes, Iblis is the Islamic equivalent of Satan, the devil.
In standard Orthodox theology across all Abrahamic religions, Satan is the antagonist. The story is straightforward. God creates Adam, commands the angels to bow, Satan refuses. Satan is cast out. End of story. But Al-Hallaj flips the entire moral architecture of the narrative. How does he reinterpret Iblis?
He reinterprets the story through the lens of absolute, uncompromising monotheism and the madness of divine love. In the traditional narrative, Iblis refuses to bow to Adam because he is made of fire and Adam is made of clay. It is an act of arrogant pride. But Al-Hallaj argues that Iblis's refusal is not rooted in pride, but in a tragic, consuming love for God.
Walk me through his logic, because on the surface, refusing a direct command from God seems like the exact opposite of devotion.
Al-Hallaj argues that Iblis was the ultimate, truest monotheist. God had commanded all the entities in heaven to bow to Adam. But Iblis understood the absolute oneness of God so deeply and loved God so exclusively that he simply could not bring himself to bow to anything or anyone other than his beloved. He knew that refusing the command would result in eternal damnation and exile from God's presence. But his love was so total that he willingly accepted the curse of eternal punishment, rather than compromise his exclusive devotion by bowing to a created being.
I am really trying to wrap my mind around the psychological depth of that. I can only compare it to a deeply intense, fiercely loyal, and somewhat destructive romantic relationship. Imagine a fiercely loyal lover, And the beloved says, I demand that you go and kiss that other person's feet as a test of your obedience to me. And the lover looks at them and says, no. Even if you hate me for it, even if you banish me forever and punish me, my devotion to you is so absolute that I will never bow my head to anyone but you.
That is precisely the emotional register Al-Hallaj is operating in. He is drawing on the pre-Islamic and Islamic literary tradition of the Majnun, the mad lover, the one whose passion completely destroys their reason and their adherence to social norms. In the Tawasin, Iblis is elevated from a mere villain to a tragic hero of monotheism. Iblis and Al-Hallaj become parallel figures. Both are cast out, both are condemned by the Orthodox authorities, and both accept their destruction as the price of absolute love.
But the implications of that are terrifying for any organized religion. You are pitching mystical knowledge, the direct experience of divine love, directly against orthodox obedience. You are suggesting that sometimes following the absolute truth of love requires you to break the literal laws laid down by God. If the ultimate act of devotion looks indistinguishable from the ultimate act of heresy, how can any religious institution maintain order?
They can't. And that is exactly why the Abbasid state realized they had to execute him. If even Satan can be rehabilitated as a hero of monotheism, then the entire legal, moral, and political structure of the caliphate collapses.
So the trap is set. He has threatened the Hajj economy with his Kaaba of the heart. He has shattered theological boundaries with Al-Hallaj, and he has undermined the very concept of orthodox obedience with his defense of Iblis. In 913 CE, the authorities finally arrest him, they bring him back to Baghdad and throw him into the dungeons. But he doesn't die in 913. He stays in prison for 9 years. If he was such an obvious and existential threat, why did the bureaucratic machinery of the state take nearly a decade to kill him?
Because the history of heresy trials is rarely about theology. It is almost entirely about politics. In the 10th century Abbasid court, claiming to be God or preaching esoteric mysticism wasn't actually that uncommon, and it was largely ignored by the state if the mystic in question stayed out of politics.
Oh, really?
Yeah. You were only prosecuted for heresy when your theological following became a political liability for the ruling factions.
So if you are a mystic quietly experiencing Fana in a cave in the mountains, the caliph doesn't care. But if you have thousands of followers in the capital city demanding moral reform based on your teachings, suddenly your poetry is a capital offense.
Exactly. And the court of Caliph al-Muqaddir was a snake pit of rival factions, financial crises, and competing viziers. During his 9 years in prison, Al-Hallaj's treatment fluctuated wildly. When viziers who were sympathetic to his calls for reform or who had connections to his followers were in power, he was treated well. He was allowed to receive visitors and even permitted to preach.
But the tides turn.
They do. When the opposing faction took control, specifically a vizier named Hamid ibn al-Abbas, who wanted to purge his political rivals, Al-Hallaj was used as a pawn.
They needed to condemn Al-Hallaj to discredit the political officials who had supported him.
Yes. The vizier heavily pressured the Maliki jurists, threatening them and demanding a fatwa, a legal ruling declaring Al-Hallaj's blood lawful to shed. They revived the old accusations. They brought up the Formation Rebellion charge. They deliberately misrepresented his writings on the Kaaba. Finally, the political pressure was too immense, the judges capitulated, and the fatwa was issued.
Which brings us back to where we began our deep dive today, March 26, 922 CE, the banks of the Tigris River.
The execution was a protracted, gruesome orchestration designed to humiliate him and ensure his followers had no relics to venerate. He was brought before the immense crowd. First, he was violently punched in the face by the executioner. Then, he was subjected to a brutal whipping. Some historical accounts record up to 1,000 lashes until he was entirely unconscious.
Just horrific.
After that, his limbs were amputated. He was decapitated, though some accounts say he was hanged, and his body was further mutilated. Finally, to prevent his grave from becoming a site of pilgrimage, they doused his remains in oil, burned him to ash, and scattered the ashes into the current of the Tigris River.
And throughout this unimaginable physical trauma, the records indicate he maintained his composure. He had finally reached the flame. He reportedly prayed for his executioners, asking God to forgive them because they were acting out of adherence to the law while he was dying for the truth.
It's a powerful image.
But amidst all the blood and the fire, there is one specific historical detail from that day that cuts deeper than all the physical violence combined. And this is something we really need to clarify, because history often gets this wrong.
Yes. The story of his friend, Shibli.
Let's focus on this, because it is the emotional climax of his life. As Al-Hallaj is being tortured and humiliated, the furious, ignorant mob is throwing stones at him, and Al-Hallaj is silent. He absorbs the physical impact of the stones from the crowd without making a single sound. But standing in the middle of that violent mob is his old friend, a fellow Sufi master named Shibli.
Shibli is in an agonizing position. He knows the truth. He understands exactly what Al-Hallaj is experiencing, and he knows that Al-Hallaj is not a heretic. But Shibli is also acutely aware of the political reality. He knows the Abbasid spies are watching the crowd, looking for sympathizers to arrest. He knows he needs to blend in with the violent frenzy of the mob to save his own life.
Right. Now, over the centuries, a lot of romanticized poetry has depicted Shibli throwing a beautiful soft rose at his friend to signify his hidden allegiance.
Right, the famous rose.
But wait, I actually want to pause you right there because we need to make a major historical correction here. The older, more visceral historical texts explicitly state that Shibli did not throw a rose.
Yes.
To blend in with the crowd while secretly acknowledging his friend, Shibli throws a clod of earth, a piece of dried mud, and it is only when this clod of earth strikes him that Al-Hallaj finally breaks his silence and cries out in pain.
It is a devastating moment of symbolism, arguably even more so than the rose myth.
I have to ask about the psychology of that reaction. The heavy stones of the mob are fracturing his bones, and he is silent. A piece of dried mud from his friend touches him, and he weeps. Why?
When later asked why he wept at the clod of earth but not the stones, Al-Hallaj's reasoning cuts to the absolute core of human betrayal. The stones came from the ignorant masses. They don't understand mystical theology. They are simply following the dictates of the state. Their violence is blind, and therefore it can be endured and forgiven.
They don't know any better.
Exactly. But the clod of earth came from a friend. It came from someone who possessed the knowledge of the truth, who knew that Al-Hallaj was innocent, but who chose to participate in the mechanics of the mob throwing dirt just to look like everyone else, to preserve his own safety.
It is the weight of betrayal. It isn't the physical impact of the object. It is the moral impact of a friend compromising their integrity. Shibli knew the truth, but he let the fear of the crowd dictate his actions. He threw a clod of dirt to assuage his own conscience and appease the state, but in doing so, he abandoned his friend to the flame.
And that profound tragedy is part of what cemented Al-Hallaj's immortality. The Abbasid state did everything in their power to erase him. They burned his books, they burned his body, and they scattered his ashes so there would be nothing left to remember. But they achieved the exact opposite.
They turned a controversial street preacher into a permanent archetype.
They absolutely did. While he was condemned by the state and vilified by orthodox scholars like Ibn Kathir in life, Mansur al-Hallaj was almost unanimously canonized by later generations of mystics and poets. He became a towering, inescapable figure in Persian literature and the broader Sufi tradition.
Let's trace that legacy because his influence is massive. The greatest minds of the Persian literary tradition, figures like Farid-ud-Din Attar, Hafiz, Rumi, Attar, and later thinkers like Iqbal Lahori, they all revered him. They didn't see him as a charlatan. They saw him as the ultimate martyr of divine love.
Rumi, perhaps the most famous mystical poet in history, wrote an incredibly staunch defense of him. Rumi noted that when the laws and the history are written by corrupt, cynical authorities, the truly righteous person will inevitably end up on the executioner's block. He wrote, "When the pen is in the hand of a traitor, unquestionably Mansur is on a gibbet."
Wow. And Attar included him in his famous Memorial of the Saints, cementing his biographical legend, right?
Yeah. Yes. Hafiz used his name as a shorthand for the ecstatic lover. Even Attar's quatrains echo his intense, agonizing yearning for the divine. And jumping forward to the 20th century, Muhammad Iqbal Lahori, the great philosopher-poet, engaged deeply with Al-Hallaj's concept of the ego and the dynamic nature of the self.
So his Iranian roots really flourished in that Persian literary tradition.
Oh, massively. And his legacy even crosses religious and cultural boundaries. Modern interpretations frequently view him as a quasi-Christ-like figure, the innocent man executed by a rigid legal system for preaching an eternal kingdom of God.
All right.
Furthermore, scholars and authors have drawn profound parallels between Al-Hallaj's cry of An-al-Haq and the ancient Hindu Upanishadic concept of Aham Brahmasmi.
Aham Brahmasmi, which translates to I am Brahman, or I am the ultimate reality. It is the exact same phenomenological realization occurring in a completely different cultural context. It highlights this universal human drive to look past external rituals and find the architecture of the divine inside the self.
He lost his physical body in the most brutal, calculated way the 10th century could devise. But he became an immortal literary and philosophical archetype. He became a mirror for humanity to study its own relationship with truth, authority, and the ego.
So we have traversed a massive historical and psychological landscape today. We followed a boy from the Fars province, deeply influenced by the Zoroastrian ethics of internal purity, good thoughts, good words, good deeds, as he memorized the Quran. We watched him discard the elite robes of institutional mysticism to wander the edges of the world.
It's quite a journey.
We analyzed how his poetic teaching of the Kaaba of the heart terrified an empire built on pilgrimage economics. We unpacked the dense theology of Al-Hallaj, contrasting the heresy of Hulul with the profound mystical annihilation of Fana. We explored his radical defense of Satan and the Tawasin. And finally, we stood on the banks of the Tigris to witness his execution and his eternal canonization in Persian literature.
When we pull all of this complex medieval history into the present moment, the relevance is actually startling. We live in a modern era that is fundamentally defined by information overload and, more critically, by ego amplification. Every structure in our society, from social media to corporate hierarchies, encourages us to build our personal brand.
Oh, absolutely.
We are incentivized to shout, "I am here, look at me," and to accumulate external validation.
Yes, we live in the absolute zenith of the hyperinflated ego. The sponge is desperately trying to absorb as much water as possible.
And into that modern noise, the legacy of Al-Hallaj offers a radical, uncompromising counter-narrative. He suggests that ultimate truth, ultimate peace, and ultimate connection are not found in the amplification of the self, but in its total annihilation, in the Fana, in having the courage to become the moth that willingly dies into the flame.
It is a profound reminder that the most significant spiritual journeys do not require a passport, a physical pilgrimage, or a massive public following. They require the incredibly difficult, quiet, internal work of circling the Kaaba of your own heart.
And it forces us to interrogate how we navigate our own societies. How do we treat those who do not fit into our neat institutional boxes? Do we engage with them, or do we silence them because they threaten our intellectual and social comfort?
Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with today. I want you to think about Shibli, standing in that terrified, surging crowd on the banks of the Tigris, watching his friends suffer. In your own life, when you encounter a truth that goes against the grain, when you see someone standing up for something genuine but deeply unpopular, what is your reaction? Are you one of the mob, throwing stones out of ignorance and blind adherence to the crowd?
That's a tough question.
It is. Are you standing openly with the truth, no matter the political or social cost? Or, and this is the hardest one, are you throwing a clod of earth? Knowing in your heart exactly what is right, but participating in the mob just enough to save yourself? The next time you feel the immense pressure of the crowd, the next time you are tempted to compromise your truth for the illusion of safety, ask yourself, what are you throwing?